So first of all, on behalf of the Pro-Prefetti, now he's called in this way, of the first section of our Dicastery for Evangelization, which meanwhile is the first in the row of all the dicasteries in the Vatican of 16. Archbishop Fisichella, I want to greet you all, and he is greeting you as well because he is very proud that you are so much interested in what's going on in our dicastery. As our Pro-Prefetti often says, our ministry is networking, listening to the experience of the local churches and bring it into a conversation with other local churches. We are not the Office for Divine Worship for the Universal Church. We have to network. That is our ministry. Insofar, I'm very glad to communicate with you about key principles for liturgical catechesis of children by this very lecture, and our later panel will have the possibility of sharing. Thank you also for this kind invitation. It is very much touching me to celebrate Mass with you this morning at the so beautiful Basilica of the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception. So it's a great pleasure for me to speak, to be back actually here at Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. after 33 years, since I've doing some research and scientific work on the RCIA in the USA, and to be able to give this guest lecture today. The topic is, as it were, along the same lines that I followed during my studies here more than 30 years ago, when Professor Catherine Dooley was particularly dedicated to the RCIC here, and I had many conversations with her at that time for preparing my doctoral dissertation. With great gratitude and joy, we in the Dicastery of Evangelization in the Vatican also perceive how profoundly the Catholic University of America in Washington takes up and continues catechetical questions and dimensions, especially in the transition of faith with children. The Journal for Evangelization and Catechesis gives an excellent overview and is gladly read and passed on in Rome. It is to the greater credit of Professor Raymond Stutzinski, who as editor has given this journal a solid profile in such a short time, that it is no longer possible to imagine the landscape of scientific publications without it. The way in which Professor Jem Sullivan, in her research as well as in her teaching, has pursued with some competence and sustainability even before the publication of the new directory for catechesis in 2020, an impulse of this document, which is becoming ever more important in catechesis and on which so much is decided for the transmission of faith in postmodern and secular times, leads us not least into the middle of today's theme of my guest lecture. It is about the via pulchritudinis. For me, no one has put it in words more aptly than Pope Benedict XVI when he said, "Truth is beautiful, and what is beautiful is true." This connection is fundamental, theologically, dogmatically, and catechetically of highest plausibility. It presupposes, of course, that the witness and mediator of faith has himself found a contemplative approach to beauty and does not lose himself in the trivial. The more faith threatens to disappear from our public spaces, this morning the Catholic Church in Germany has published the number of people who dropped out of the church during last year. It's 500,000, about 22 million Catholics in Germany. Imagine this. And it seems to pushed into private sphere, our faith, the greater danger of kitschification exists, which seems to consist in an infantilization, especially in catechesis with children, which I would like to discuss in more detail later. In this context alone, it is very remarkable that we as Catholic Christians, who should actually have an innate awareness of the importance of the via pulchritudinis, are reminded very often by Muslims of the indispensable importance that the sense of the creative should claim in the communication of faith. The writer Navid Kermani, who received the Peace Prize of the German book trade a few years ago and dared to pray publicly in his acceptance speech, recently pointed out this indispensable importance of rituals in religions. Literally, he said, I quote him, "Let no one be surprised that churches remain empty when it is no longer beautiful, when people no longer pay attention to form at Mass, no longer pay attention to the foreign, because what is more foreign than God? Quote, end of quotation.
Wow.
And Kermani continues by pointing out that religions are superfluous if they only act as great explainers, if they are just another union or an NGO. He concludes, I quote him, religions ask the big question. Ideologies give the answer right along with it. In addition to his initial attention to our topic, I would like to take up an essay that the then theologian Joseph Ratzinger had in Munich in 1958, exactly 65 years ago. It reads today like a prophetic word to our time of the Church that can give orientation when we ask what differentiations are necessary so that children with their parents can find their way to the faith of the Church through liturgical catechesis. Still under quite different social conditions of life, Joseph Ratzinger notes already in 1958 that for most Christians, faith is only a habitual convention. In this context, he gives food for thought, I quote him, in the long run, the Church will not be spared having to break down piece by piece from the appearance of its covering with the world, and to be again what it is, a community of believers. In fact, its missionary power will only be able to grow through such external losses. It is a process that will take place with or without the Church's intervention. End of quotation. With regard to the Church sacramental liturgy, the theologian Ratzinger already saw the danger at that time, I quote him, by not only giving sacraments away, but by beggaring them, they are profoundly devalued. End of quotation. Children have a very deep sense of this. What adults claim to be important but do not commit appropriately has long since lost its significance in the eyes of children. Whereas in Europe, for instance, adults hardly go to confession anymore, one can hardly expect that this will open a way to this sacrament for their children. In order to find more honest differentiation for the sake of credibility, Ratzinger proposes already in 1958 3 levels of action in his proposed process of deworldizing the Church, which are to be considered precisely with regard to the possibilities of liturgical catechesis with children. On the one hand, he speaks of the level of the sacramental, which was once surrounded by arcane discipline in the liturgy of the Church. On this, Ratzinger says, I quote him, the more the Church will carry out the self-demarcation, the distinction of the Christian, if necessary, toward the small flock, the more realistically it will recognize its task on the second level of the proclamation of the faith. End of quotation. Here Ratzinger distinguishes 2 types of proclamation. As he said, the predicatio ordinaria and the missionary proclamation. The former he describes as an inner liturgical process. The latter is more the attempt to stretch the radius of action as far as possible and to orient it precisely in a missionary way. On the third level of personal relationships, says Ratzinger, it would be completely wrong to aim at an isolation of believing Christians from non-believers. It is about the formation of a family community, of which Joseph Ratzinger says that the Christian should be experienced precisely as a joyful person among people and as a true fellow human being, where he cannot be a fellow Christian. In order to understand the special nature of the sacramental, neither as an elitist separation from the world, nor as a loading of all the heavier burdens and responsibilities, Joseph Ratzinger adds the idea of substitution as it has already developed in the Judaism and can be understood as one for all, which does not mean all for one. In this understanding horizon, sacraments are positive signs of effective salvation. They indicate what is promised to all in the faith, without falsely and untrustworthily appropriating. As positive signs of salvation, the recipient embodies the more of faith without exclusively including others from it. However, the more, the magis as we say in the Latin language, always corresponds to a process in which the other is moved to reach out for it. This is a spiritual and didactic dynamic, which will be developed in the following as key principles for liturgical catechesis with children in 7 points, as I already mentioned. Starting from the reflections of the theologian Joseph Ratzinger on the future of the Church, mind you, 65 years ago, the principle of theologically responsible and responsible graduality is to be endeavored with regard to our topic. In the catechetical tradition of the Church, it has received attention from the very beginning. If we consider how from the earliest times of the Church, the incorporation of first adults and finally of entire families took place through the catechumenate with its various phases and stages, we have here a reliable parameter. That's already very much expressed in the directory of 1997, and the new directory from 2020 took it over. So a first key principle I would like to introduce to you is intergenerationality and narration. The aforementioned learning context of children in the early church growing into the faith as part of the larger family community was further condensed in later folk church times. In the book of Joshua it says, "I and my household will serve the Lord." And this phrase already speaks biblically of how children can learn from the faith of adults in liturgical and catechetical practice and increasingly learn how to be Christians. Implicitly, this also addresses what we are currently rediscovering in pedagogy as intergenerationality. It connects with other aspects of narration. Yesterday, Monsignor Charles Pope was talking about the loss of storytelling. Actually, that's the same. Where grandparents tell children about their faith and testify where and how their faith has sustained them, especially in difficult times of their biography, this way of communication takes on an eminently important catechetical significance. I personally remember well, as children on long winter evenings, we used to ask as children our parents and grandparents to tell us about the past, especially about the times of the Second World War and how they lived and believed in the resistance. At some point, we all knew the stories and yet wanted to hear them again and again. Narration as interpretation and intergenerational as experience, intergenerationality as experience. The situation of today's nuclear families with fewer and fewer children and the relatives as well as grandparents who often live far away and are not experienced very much means that the opportunity to pass on the faith is evaporating in many families. On the other hand, I have observed on various occasions how after a Sunday service, those children who still go to church with their parents play with each other in the church square. In this way, a new kinship of faith develops in the opposite direction. What used to be the fellowship between siblings and cousins now becomes a new bond and commitment. This brings a second key principle into view, which seems to me to be increasingly important in mediating a liturgical catechesis. So a second key principle, with each other and towards. In societies that are increasingly losing their social cohesion because family ties are dissolving due to the divorce of parents, too expensive and few housing options, and much more, what is indispensable in sociological as well as pastoral terms is often perceived only too late. Where social realities give rise to new mentalities, ideals that have been lived and witnessed are increasingly marginalized. At the same time, they often remind us of of what many lack and long for. During a recent visit to the World Congress of Mercy on Samoa Island, I was able to experience in this island situation how indigenous structures have an effect right down to present-day family constellations and still shape them, giving the society a high degree of stability. In other words, it's about a context in which with each other and the opposite is experienced that has pedagogical quality. Liturgically experienced community needs a counterpart in dialogical terms, where, for example, evening prayers or table prayers with children, if they are still practiced at all, become exclusively horizontal self-reflections, the relational awareness of faith is lost over time. Because God is a you, the children becomes an I only in this you. On Samoa Island, I could see in the integration of the indigenous liturgical practices how in the larger family context, this orientation toward God that uplifts the person is brought into liturgy of the Church. Even in the concern about the climate catastrophe, which can be perceived even more clearly there, the prayer of praise for God's creation, also in the awareness of preserving it, is subordinated to the view of a responsible togetherness that can be derived from it as a consequence of God's presence. In this context, there's a growing awareness of a third key principle in catechesis of the liturgy with children. That's called didactics of symbols and mystagogy. In her book, The Beauty of Faith, Using Christian Art to Spread the Good News, Professor Jem Sullivan talks in the 5th chapter about Christian art and the education of children. She quotes philosopher John Crosby, who says, I quote him, "Sometimes Christians think of education in a way that takes too little account of beauty. Christian educators sometimes fail to notice the great formative potential that the experience of beauty has for children. The child is enabled by the experience of beauty to know good and evil by a kind of connaturality even before it receives detailed moral instruction. The human soul is so profoundly made for beauty that it is deeply formed for the good by the early experience of beauty. But it can also be deeply deformed by the early experience of what is ugly." Quote, end of quotation. Beauty in images of art, in music and liturgical gestures can only be grasped and retained by the child where there is a symbol didactic condensation. For this it needs an escort into the mystery for which the respective art stands and lifts the good into the picture. Already the fathers of the Church, first of all Maximus Confessor, speaks about the necessity of a mystagogy in the context of arcane discipline. If in dogmatics the liturgical theological axiom lex orandi, lex credendi is used for this essential connection, it can be formulated even more explicitly here. In order to do justice to the catechetical power of the rites, and perhaps also to the lex orandi as an excellent place of the catechesis of the people of God, so in the directory in Article 96, it is necessary to understand the lex credendi integrally, from which a lex catechisandi is to be derived. In good art and true beauty, this effect is conveyed eo ipso, a symbolic didactics that recognizes the beautiful as the true, knows that art which is useful in this sense must point beyond itself to the Creator as the greater. Where pictures and images, on the other hand, lose themselves in this worldliness and rather to be assigned to the world of trash, a symbolic didactic mystagogy can hardly take place. In view of this danger, the new directory for catechesis deals explicitly with the opportunities and limits of a digital world that surrounds people today and with which especially children grow up. It's expressed in the articles of 365 to 372. And even more in his apostolic exhortation, Christus Vivit, Pope Francis, as a result of the Synod of Bishops on Youth, stated what is already able to be recalled here with regard to key principles for liturgical catechesis with children, above all as a limit. He says, I quote him, "It is not healthy to confuse communication with mere virtual contact. Indeed, the digital environment is also one of loneliness, manipulation, exploitation, and violence. Digital media can expose people to the risk of addiction, isolation, and gradual loss of contact with concrete reality, blocking the development of authentic interpersonal relationships." End of quotation. Keeping children away from too early digital self-occupation leads not only in biological, medical, but also in psychological terms to a greater learning capacity in the mystagogical sense, to a richer imagination of the invisible, and to a more substantial creativity. We know this already from the times when the television had been invented. This brings a fourth principle into view, which I would like to state here in the required brevity for the Catecheology to be developed here. It is called elementarization and family culture. For liturgical learning among children, it has always been decisive how content and forms can be elementarized. Learning and grasping the whole in detail is already a biblical principle that children's Bible in particular make their own. To open central pericopes to a further pictorial imagination and to recognize in them what is essential for the Christian church faith is a catechetical learning step, which admittedly needs context in which what has already been taken up is always taken up anew and rediscovered. Also in this sense, a visual, tactile and cognitive repetitio is the Mater Studiorum, as we already heard yesterday. Effectively, this has been demonstrated in what the Jewish family culture produced during the period of exile in Israel before Christ. At a time when Orthodox Judaism was politically and socially marginalized and denied the opportunity to pray in the temple in Jerusalem, it is precisely in the situation of dispersion that the shaped religious practice in the family carries the faith through a critical time and makes it further connectable. What we still know today from the Jewish Passover ritual, according to which the youngest asked the oldest to recount and recall the event of the Exodus, exemplifies how religious education is first and foremost liturgical catechesis for children. From the Jewish family culture can be seen, faith needs form, otherwise it evaporates. This experience is linked to a fifth context, namely language, ability, and contemplation. What we have already considered with regard to narration and intergenerational sharing is one side of a liturgical catechesis for children, to which must be added a second. Silence and listen. Incline your heart's ear, seek peace. So says a new spiritual hymn in Germany. It considers that every faculty of speech in faith needs a contemplation context, and ultimately only from silent wonder can speech and prayer emerge. I remember the words of our spiritual director at the seminary, who asked a guest on his visit about his impressions of the seminarians. The answer was sobering. Loud faces, loud faces. You can see and feel it in the people if they have learned to be silent and if they come from the great silence. In a short dialogue of Philip Gröning's great film, The Great Silence, about the life of monks in the Grand Chartreuse in France, a Carthusian at the Sunday Recreation reports about the abolition of the ritual washing of hands before the common meal in another monastery. Another confrere immediately expresses his great regret when he says, "If we lose the signs, we lose our meanings." In a time of society in which children can hardly learn and endure silence, in which permanent entertainment and variety have become a form of sprinkling, learning contemplation would be a first step towards becoming capable of speaking in a deeper sense. Where we heard yesterday about this already, increasing ADHS illness make learning so difficult for children in schools. An impulse could arise from the liturgy of the Church, in which the prerequisite for all knowledge consists in silence. Silvia Walter, a spiritual writer from Switzerland, puts this diagnosis of the times into words of prayer. She says, I quote her, "Lord, someone must endure you. To endure you without running away, to endure your absence without doubting your coming, to endure your silence and still sing. Endure your sufferings, your death, and live out of them. Someone has to do this for everyone else." End of quotation. Whoever finds into this depth of contemplation and takes others into it can convey another key principle. Where children can see and experience this in adults, they experience a coherence that makes them credible. So a sixth key principle, identity and representation. The German sociologist Ulrich Beck once pointed out that the question of the future is the question of one's own identity. Whoever can say who he or she is has the intention and consideration for himself, especially in a diffuse world. The fact that this veritable need is often activated by radical groups, especially in politics, must make Christians all the more alert and sensitive to the great graduality shown at the beginning, which can help in one's own faith orientation to find one's own position and to take it up dialogically. Learning faith and deepening it in liturgical is, for Christians and especially for children, always a process of waking and maturing. Where the reflection of one's own identity, especially for children, leads to a feeling of loneliness, you can and must experience in adults a grateful readiness to take responsibility for their vocation as an encouragement. Identity and substitution in a liturgical catechesis needs differentiation from general entertainment, a differentiation between primary symbols and secondary symbols, so often drawn from the lack of knowledge or identification. For example, in the design of children's services and especially First Communion celebrations. Here, especially after the COVID pandemic and the many digital offers for the design of church services, an observation is to be critically evaluated according to which children go into their room at home during so-called liturgies, when they can cuddle with their teddy bear and then continue to participate reconciled and relaxed, as they say. The theologian Joseph Ratzinger sees this connection between identity and substitution precisely in the fact that the whole of history lives from it. I quote him, which has its culmination and unification in the togetherness of the church and non-church, of believers and pagans. The opposition of church and non-church does not mean a side by side and not a counter side, but a for each other in which each side has its function. End of quotation. In the future, a liturgical catechesis with and for children will have to address this meaning of differentiation in the sense of locating one's own identity, never in the sense of elitist segregation, but in service to one's own home in the faith of the Church. Her larger liturgy must be like fitting into a garment into which the child continues to grow. To shorten the garment where it does not seem to be fit at the moment makes the face of the Church small all around for one's own subjectiveness and rationalities. This movement must inevitably follow another complementary one, a seventh key principle, openness and evangelization. Only where identity is reflected and experienced in faith, there can be openness. An evangelizing introduction to faith with children, which is different from a catechesis of identity formation, will, in the spirit of the post-synodal cry of Pope Francis, Evangelii Gaudium, focus above the importance of it in its kerygma. He says, I quote him, "In the kerygma, Jesus is the agent who manifests himself in the witness of the proclaimer. The life of the witness who has experienced salvation thus becomes that which touches and moves the interlocutor." End of quotation. In this sense, a liturgical catechesis for children will have to focus ad extrem on the individual example, in the hope that a new longing will be awakened in children, often precisely from families distant from the faith and the Church. Where young people increasingly complain about the need of formlessness in everyday life, and where meaning demands form in everyday life, the individual example of the credible witness takes on a new significance in the missionary transmission of the faith. What pedagogy calls the significant other in the learning process is in liturgical catechesis for children the faithful witness in which Jesus himself acts. As he speaks and is silent, as he prays and sings, children will imitate what they thereby make their own over time. Here both are true from the mouth of the great theologian Thomas Aquinas, exempla trahunt and contemplata ali strada. Give to others what you have received. It always remains this tension between the two, which can also have a missionary effect in liturgical catechesis with children. So I'd like to conclude with some remarks. In the context of this lecture, I could only develop a criteriology for liturgical catechesis with children in our time from the plea for a theological responsible graduality, as the theologian Joseph Ratzinger already pointed out 65 years ago. If the theologian Walter Kasper once called the liturgy as sang dogmatics, one can understand that all sustainable introduction to the faith needs form, and the mystagogical approach, as developed in the early church, must again become the way in an adapted manner to be further developed in post-Christian and secular society for liturgical catechesis with children. Thank you so much for your attention.